So you can see that there are steps, including reviewing the sample paper. I have also included a copy of the sample paper in the announcement and asked you to read it. This is really important, I think, in understanding and having a clear model of what you're doing. So I highly recommend you read this. You can see that you're going to have an introduction. You're going to identify the text, the overall claim thesis. You're going to explain the author's purpose and audience. You're going to summarize the article and end with your overall evaluation thesis statement. So those are the elements of the introduction. And I will show you in the sample paper in a moment how the author did this. If you want to include a short introductory paragraph that has a hook and a brief bit of background and then your thesis and then do the summary, you could also do that. Or if you wanted, you could do a hook and then a brief summary of the article and then end with your evaluation thesis statement. How you organize the introduction is up to you, but those are the elements that are expected. In the body of the paper, you're going to have paragraphs that evaluate the evidence and the counter evidence. You're going to have a paragraph or paragraphs evaluating language use, and you're going to have a paragraph or paragraphs evaluating author credibility. And you're also going to, in here, talk about the counter argument in some space in here. So the basic details are that you're going to be doing sort of an in-depth look at you're going to be doing like an in-depth look at the article and explaining how the word choice, how the evidence usage, how potentially the bias, how the counter argument, how all these different things factor into the actual effectiveness of the article. Then you'll have a conclusion and a references page. Okay. So what I would like to show you that I think will be more specifically helpful is I'm going to start. I think I have it pulled up already. Let's see. I do not, but I have it over here. This is the sample paper, and I'm just going to pull it up. You can see in this sample paper the way that your paper should be laid out on the page. You have a title page, and then you have your introduction. And remember, in APA, we don't call it the introduction. We just put the title first. But one thing that this article or that this essay has that I think is probably a good thing for you to also include are these subheading sections, because that's going to keep you on track. The evidence evaluation section, the language use section, the author credibility section, the conclusion. These are all the different sections of the paper that this person has chosen to kind of go over. You can see in this example that right here she talks about the counter argument, and this is where she brings in the article, her outside source. So if you look up here, you can see that this is included in the evidence evaluation, which is probably a good idea for you to mention in the evidence what the counter argument does to that evidence, the relationship there. You could also include a separate counter argument section. It's kind of up to you. What I recommend doing is creating these sections that you want to discuss. And if you look back at the thesis statement, her argument is effective because she uses a variety of strong evidence and convincing language, and her credibility supports the argument. And if you look down here, we also have language, which she mentioned, and credibility. So these sections of the paper are really coming from her thesis statement, evidence, language, credibility, and then she has a section for each in her paper. And I recommend that you do something along the same lines. If you look at the planner, you can also see that there is this section on evidence, which would include fallacies in a paper probably, and counter evidence. I put those together. And then if you look back at the second part of the planner, language and credibility. So in this case, this person didn't create sections for each part of her planner. You're more than welcome to do that if you think you have enough to say. You can also structure it based around your thesis statement. So whatever you included in your thesis statement to explain why you think this person is effective or not is something that would be helpful to think about in creating your paper. So I'll give you an example of how you might want to set this up. The first thing I would do is I would go back to my APA, my trusty APA template, which is listed under in our class under the APA style resources, which is right down here under content, APA style resources. Here's my formatting template, and I'm just going to download it. I'm going to call it, maybe I'll call it You can see it's kind of a work in progress. Maybe something like this. And, you would change your information. Whatever your title is would go here again. And then you would have your introduction. If you look back at the structure of the sample paper, you can see that it starts with the summary. So I'll just pull that up. And you can see right from the get-go that there's a summary sentence in the article, What Would It Take to Set American Kids Free, written by Alexander Land, blah, 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 blah. So this person has their summary, which is kind of a long summary. And then they have their little thesis paragraph. Your summaries look like they might be shaping up to be a little shorter. So I would recommend a formula like this. For your paper, I would do something like a hook, summary, thesis statement. That's what I would recommend doing because your summaries, for the most part, as I was looking through your planners, your summaries were a little bit shorter. So hook, summary, thesis statement. And then based on what I said in my thesis statement, I would think about the different sections of the paper I would want to include. So maybe something, and then I would also think about the planner and how I wanted the planner. This is a little bit off. There we go. How I would maybe want to follow the planner. So I could start with evidence evaluation. And then looking back on the planner, maybe I would have a section because maybe you may not need to include every single piece of evidence that you included in here. You may not want to include the fallacies. Check your feedback first because a lot of you identified things that weren't actually fallacies, or you identified fallacies that other people were making that the author was pointing out. So unless you have a pretty strong case for Belkin having made a logical fallacy, I would consider maybe not including this part. Maybe you want to. Maybe the fallacies are really important in your paper and they're part of your thesis statement. Then you could create a fallacies section, a subheading in your paper. If not, maybe you want to just skip to the counter evidence. A counter evidence section, and then language use. And for some of you, this may only be a paragraph. There may not be a lot to say here, whereas up here, you may have a ton to say about the evidence evaluation. You may want to include evidence evaluation and logical fallacies. Really what you're doing here is you're thinking about the different sections of the paper as based on what you included in your thesis statement, but this will also give you an idea of what to put in your paper and how to pull it from the planner. Because when you have a section that's called language use, and then you have your section that's called, author credibility, what you want to say about author credibility, you can look back at your planner and say, okay, author credibility, yep, okay. I want to say that they seem pretty credible, but I have a problem with their worldview. So maybe this section, you said there is no evidence of bias in the article. That depends on you whether or not you want to include that in your critical evaluation. You may think, I don't really have much to say about that. I don't even want to include it. Or you may have found out something really interesting about the author's worldview. Like you think it's really important that Belkin works for a financial journal and you want to talk about that. You can include a section on those things. You could say author credibility and worldview. So these are just basic subheadings that you're adapting from the planner to kind of coincide with the things that you say in your thesis statement. And then finally, you'll have your references page. I'll create a reference for y'all for the article that we used, and you can use CiteFast or you can use the EBSCOhost and your knowledge to create the reference for your outside source. You'll put a conclusion at the end, and that's basically how you're going to want to structure it. And then the last resource I'll mention is one that I've included in the D2L announcement about CSET paragraphs. That's a guide for helping you if you're having trouble figuring out how to create these evidence-based paragraphs. Check out that resource if you're worried about actually constructing the paragraphs.